You know, my elementary school is no different from anyone else's. The boy-girl crush thing was rampant. But for me, it went beyond who was going to sit next to whom on the swing set at recess. I started noticing that the adults around me were kind of pushing all of us into this weird male-female paired-off kind of world. You know, the teachers would make us sit boy-girl in the classroom, right? Who hasn't had to do that? I know now that's about control and not heterosexuality. However, what teacher in his right mind would put a gay boy between two girls in every class and expect there to be control? They really didn't think that part through, which is why me and Beth Morgan spent all of elementary school in opposing corners of each room. Where I grew up in Pennsylvania, it's quite cold in the winter, and when I was in elementary school, which was a public school, they would keep us inside for phys ed classes, and they would teach us square dancing. Anybody here have a similar experience? Sounds like a good night at the library, actually. Well, until my fundamentalist Christian mother found out that I was dancing at school, I was always forced to square dance with Sherry Pyatt. And I really wanted to square dance with Stephen Krasnowski. And even though years later I found out that Sherry was a lesbian, it was nice, but it still wasn't exactly what I was looking for. I couldn't understand why the adults around me were stealing my choices from me. They were making me do things that felt very unnatural. But you know, we don't teach children to speak their minds, so I didn't speak mine. I kept quiet about everything. A little bit about my home life. My father was a fundamentalist Baptist minister, and that of course meant that me and my four sisters, we were all little fundamentalist Baptists growing up. And if you don't know what it's like to grow up in that kind of a home, it's just like being Amish and in the military at the same time. It's exactly what it is. It's like having electricity but being afraid to turn it on. And as kids growing up in that environment, what that version of Christianity really taught us was it taught us how to lie about our humanity. Because we were taught at a very early age that our humanity was evil and not something that should ever be celebrated. It should always be either discarded or repressed. And what that translated down to us as meaning is that we just shouldn't talk to adults about personal stuff. That's exactly what we did. We said nothing to anyone about really anything going on in our lives. When I was about 14, my parents took me and my sisters to a church in a neighboring town, and during the sermon, the minister who was speaking kind of got off on a little tangent and started talking about a new disease he had read about in a magazine that week. And he was talking about the disease that we know now as AIDS, and he started talking about the people that were going to get it. And he kept referring to these people as homosexuals and faggots. And I had heard both of those words before, but I really didn't know what they meant. You know, it just always sounded bad every time I heard someone use them. Well, this guy went on to give his definition of those words, and as soon as he started describing gay men, I started feeling this kinship with his description. I really felt like he was describing me, which felt very odd to have, you know, these feelings for as far back as I could remember, and then all of a sudden in public, here's some man talking about it. Well, he then went on to say that all homosexuals were child molesters, but now, thanks to this new disease, God would just be wiping them off the face of the earth. So in about 30 minutes worth of time in that church service, I got a definition of who I was, and then I got a prediction for my future. And you know, this guy was a minister, so there was no reason in my mind that I should question what he said. I just believed what he said as truth. And because I believed what he said as truth, I ended up walking down a very short road to becoming very depressed. Every day after that, when I would get up to go to school, I just wanted to kill myself. The thought of getting one day closer to becoming a child molester and then getting a horrible disease and dying just really did not seem like a life worth living. A lot of people talk about the bullying that goes on between kids when it comes to the gay issue. Rarely do you ever hear about, you know, people speaking about the bullying that goes on from adults to children. I was never bullied for being gay by other kids. It was always from other adults like that minister. About a year after I heard that sermon, I was watching one of the few television programs that my parents actually allowed us to watch. As fundamentalists, we were even lucky to have a TV in the house, but one of the programs we could watch part of was Jerry Falwell's Old Time Gospel Hour show. And if you've never seen that program, you're lucky. You know, life is very short, and that's an hour you can't get back. But for those of you who have not had the privilege of watching that program, it was and still is to this day a televised version of the church service where Jerry was the minister, now one of his sons is. And we could watch the first half hour of that program, which was the music part of the church service. It was pretty much the same gig that happened in my father's church every Sunday morning. But when it came time for Jerry to give his sermons, we had to shut the TV off. And the reason that my parents censored Jerry Falwell's sermons was that my parents were good fundamentalist Christians, and Jerry Falwell was an evangelical Christian. So to people like my parents, people like him were and are considered to be left-wing liberals and not to be listened to at any cost. My parents were did I just teach you something? Yeah? Okay, good, it's always good. Usually we just throw them all in the same pot of crazy, but there are some differences. Some differences and divisions. But, my parents were so afraid that if we listened to his sermons, we would absorb all of his liberal evangelical theology, and that would turn us into, as they put it, liberal Christians. And that's proof that everything in life is relative to your own perspective, right? That is proof. But as kids, we were starved for TV, so we really, it didn't really matter to us what was on or what the content was. If our parents said we could watch TV, we would watch television regardless of the content, just so we could sit in front of the TV. So I was watching one of his shows one Saturday morning, and right in the middle of the music part of the church service, the subject of homosexuality came up. And it came up because he had Florida's own Anita Bryant on there, allegedly singing. And, so at least this half of the room has heard her records. Okay, good. If you miss her, she does shows in Branson, Missouri now. So if you're feeling a little nostalgic for hatred, sounds like a good weekend, right? But she was up there talking about how gay people shouldn't be public school teachers and the whole deal she was on back then, which wasn't news to me. I had already heard her say those things elsewhere. But when she was done, Jerry came back up to his pulpit and he started saying some things about this that I hadn't heard yet. He said, of course it was a sin and, all those things. But he also said that it was something that God could change, because if you really believed that God was all-powerful, then God could certainly change somebody's behavior from homosexual to heterosexual. Well, I was a good fundamentalist back then. I believed what I read in my Bible, that God would literally pick up a mountain and throw it in the ocean for me if I had enough faith in him. So I thought, just thinking about having faith in God to just change my behavior isn't even nearly as much as I could be asking for. So what I heard coming out of the television that day was not judgment or condemnation, words that people usually associate with Jerry Falwell. What I heard was hope. Here is this man telling me I didn't have to kill myself, I could actually change myself. I could become like what I assumed everyone else was, or at least wanted me to be, and that was heterosexual in my behavior. So I decided right then and there that I would get as close as I could to Jerry Falwell's organization so I could find out how I could fix my life. All of a sudden, living life seemed worthwhile because I found out I could change mine. Wasn't sure how I'd get close to him, though, because everybody around me resented him so much. And maybe not for the reasons that you might have resented him. But, if you ever have to start a conversation with a fundamentalist, you can start out with that common ground you share with them of resenting people like Jerry Falwell. It's a great way to open a conversation, and you'll find a little bit more easiness. It wasn't just my parents that resented him, of course. It was my friends' parents, my teachers at my religious high school. Everybody just wrote him off as irrelevant, or as they put it, not a real Christian. But I was determined to find this fix, and I knew that my parents wanted me to go to a religious college after high school, so I thought, well, I'll just go to Jerry Falwell's University in Virginia. That'll get me closer to finding out how I can fix and save my own life, and perhaps it'll also appease my parents' wishes for continued religious education. So I made the grand announcement to my parents that I was going off to Jerry Falwell's University, and that did not fly. I know today that I could have just said, Mom and Dad, I'm gay, and they would have understood that announcement a lot more than they could not understand, as they put it, me going outside my religion to get my education. They just couldn't wrap their heads around it. In fact, they told me if I wanted to go to Jerry Falwell's University, I might as well just go to Penn State University, because to them, they were equal as far as a religious school. And stupid me, I didn't go to Penn State University. That was my ticket out right there. But they also told me if I wanted to go to his school, I would have to pay my own way. They said they didn't want any of their money going to Jerry Falwell. Just like every person in this room, right? Am I right? Tell me no one sent him a check. See? Already you have two things in common with fundamentalist Christians, and I have just started. I've kind of found in my life experience that the people on the opposite ends of this spectrum tend to have a little bit more in common than the people in the middle who haven't figured out what it is they think. Those are two exact illustrations of that. But I was determined to find this fix, so I rebelled against my parents and I went off to Jerry Falwell's University. And that's probably the first time you've heard all those words in the same sentence, right? But I graduated a year early from high school so I could get there faster. So I was 16 when I started out as a freshman at that school. And the first thing I did was I got a job working in the yearbook office because I was on my own with my school bill. So that was great. But in finding that job, I also found a boyfriend, which, needless to say, is not part of the student program at that school. Every day when I went to work, I had to deal with these feelings I had for this guy that I was working with. And, aside from our own personal dramas about whatever sin we were committing, we also had to deal with the fact that we were attending a school where if they suspected you of being gay, you were immediately outed on the phone to your parents and expelled. It just took suspicion and you were out the door. And that was really difficult to be in. I mean, it wasn't any different than my religious high school, but when I was trying to have some kind of relationship, it was even more, it was compounded a lot. But after a couple months, that relationship I was trying to have ended anyway. And I realized at that point that I had been sidetracked. You know, I wasn't at that school to be gay. I wasn't there to do anything except for try to find a way to fix my life. And I decided that I needed to kind of refocus and get back on track. But in the first few months that I was at that school, I had seen so many other students get kicked out for being suspected of being gay that I didn't have faith in my original plan anymore. I didn't think that I could just march down to the counseling center and admit that I had this struggle because I couldn't trust the counselors. And during those first couple months, I also learned that there was literally thousands of organizations and licensed therapists willing to help people go through this process of changing their behavior from homosexual to heterosexual. So I just stayed a student at that school, and then I went outside the school to find my help. And it took me about 3 minutes without the internet to find a group that was willing to help me. It was very easy. Obviously, it's even easier today. But over the next 2.5 years, I went through the whole process of what people now call becoming ex-gay. We didn't call it that back then, but that's exactly the process I went through. You know, I was never told that I would be cured of my homosexuality. That's not a word generally that's used to describe that process. That's a word that some of us use to try to say what's happening, but that's really not accurate. What I was promised is that this would be something I would have to fight every single day for the rest of my life. Well, I was a good fundamentalist back then, so I had a giant list of stuff I had to fight every day for the rest of my life anyway. So it was very palatable. And, you know, just tacking one more thing onto the bottom of that existing list really didn't seem like that big of a problem. And as I went through that process over those 2.5 years, you know, it was always difficult, but I really thought I was doing the right thing. And like everybody else that I know who's gone through that, I really thought I only had 2 options for my life. It was either end my life or change my life. So I just kept pushing to change my life. At the beginning of my senior year, a few things started happening to me that made me start questioning a bunch of stuff in my life. Initially, had nothing to do with being gay. It was just 3 parts of my fundamentalist religion that I was struggling with, like how I've been taught to treat women, how I've been taught to treat people of color, how I've been taught to treat people who had different religious beliefs than I did or none at all. And every time I acted on those 3 parts of my religion, I just kept getting this weird feeling that I was doing the wrong thing. And I couldn't shake it, so I thought, well, maybe I need to find out if anybody else has ever questioned or challenged these parts of fundamentalist Christianity. I didn't know if anybody had ever done that before. Nobody around me was asking any questions. But because I was going to such a liberal school like Jerry Falwell's University, I could go to the library on campus and find every perspective on every religion. They, of course, have that there to teach you how to fight everybody off, but I was looking for those challenges that people had made. And of course I found that I was not the first person to question those things. Obviously, many people had done that before me. But really, rather than feeling like I had found what I was looking for, I just started feeling like I had more questions. You know, I started thinking, you know, if these people have tricked me into believing 3 things as truth that I've just discovered are not, why couldn't they have tricked me into believing other things as truth? And so I decided that I needed to start questioning everything. Because, you know, I started thinking back to any time in my life when some adult had tried to teach me something, and it just didn't set right with me. And I thought back to when I was in my Christian high school, and we sat in our science class, and the science teacher taught us that Satan had ran around the earth and buried dinosaur bones in the ground, so we would dig them up and believe evolution. And I thought, gee, I wonder if that's not true, right? I'd like to thank the Department of Education of every state that accredits these schools to teach that as science. Those are the people responsible for allowing that to happen. I also thought back to my Christian high school in the student handbook where I had the section about, you know, what you could wear to school or what you couldn't wear to school. And in the section for girls, at the very end, it said that girls were not allowed to wear open-toed shoes. And then it said, and I'm quoting, because that's how you get pregnant. I'm actually glad that I was a gay boy growing up and wasn't trying to date girls, because that would have been some very awkward dates for me, trying to avoid feet. I don't know. And then, of course, then in the student handbook, they went on to talk about the evils of toe cleavage and on and on. If you've never heard of this horrible thing, just Google it and you'll be opened up to a whole new world of sin and perspective. It's really quite awful and ridiculous to teach kids those things. But I started realizing that there's probably many things that I had been taught, maybe some serious things, maybe some not so serious things that probably just weren't true. So I decided that rather than try to go through everything and pick it all out, I would just start questioning everything I'd ever been taught by any adult. And that's exactly what I did. And as I was going through that process of questioning everything, I did get to a place where I started questioning that process of changing my behavior from homosexual to heterosexual, because that was also something that some adult taught me that I should do. And I did feel like I had changed my behavior. It's quite easy to change your behavior about anything as long as someone hands you the proper motivation. Right? I mean, you can stop doing, I don't know, biting your nails or whatever else you do, I don't need to know about, if someone motivates you in the right way. And for me, the motivation to get me to change my behavior was the fear of burning in hell forever. That pretty much did it for me. But what I wasn't feeling I was changing was how I felt on the inside. And, I had been told by my counselors I would never change that because that was my evil humanity fighting against what I was trying to do. And, I bought that at the beginning, but by this point, when I was questioning adults and what they had taught me, I started thinking that maybe my counselors were just blowing smoke in my face. They were just trying to get me to not think about myself as a human being, but only to think about myself as the religious person that I had chosen to be. And I started thinking that maybe what I really needed to do was, first of all, stop listening to them, but also, rather than spend so much time and energy on rejecting myself, maybe I needed to learn how to accept myself, because it became very clear to me that I had fallen victim to the idolatry of acceptance. I was willing to do anything to gain acceptance from my friends, my family, and the world around me. And I had never felt a moment of personal peace. I had never felt like a whole person. And I realized that, I didn't need the acceptance of anyone or anything in order for me to feel those things. What I really needed to do was just learn how to accept myself. And I didn't know how to do that. Self-acceptance is not something that exists in fundamentalist versions of any religion, but I decided I really needed to do that. So I also decided not to do it while I was still a student at that school. I had about a semester to go to graduate, but I just really did not want a diploma following me around the rest of my life with Jerry Falwell's signature on it. Although now I get to talk about him every day, so that really didn't work out the way I planned originally. And thanks to eBay, that signature as an autograph is worth $150, so I could have sold it and made gas money. I threw away a whole box of stuff from when I left college that was all autographed that I thought was worthless. And now, they used to give out these little Jerry Falwell bobbleheads. What's creepier on your dashboard than Jerry Falwell doing this, the whole trip? But if you got those autographed, those go for almost $600 on eBay now that he's dead. So lots of money I threw away. But anyway, I originally wanted to graduate, of course, and then I was going to move to California, but I didn't have money to do that. So I left school, I moved back to Pennsylvania where I grew up, knowing I could get a job easily. I got a job, started saving money, and within about 8 months, I moved to Los Angeles. And after living there for about 2 years, I really felt that I had accomplished that whole self-acceptance process, and I was ready to start my coming out process. And like a lot of us, I was pretty naive at that point. I really, at first, just thought I would have to make a little list and tell those people, and then that would be over with. Until I realized that at some point in the past, some strange person had created a now universally accepted myth that everybody is heterosexual, right? If you're pregnant and you go to the doctor doesn't sit you down and say there's at least a 10% chance your child might be gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender, do they? I haven't been to a baby doctor in a while, but I'm assuming they still don't, which is really weird that they don't. But it's that weird assumption that everybody is straight. I mean, I assume everybody's gay. And if you're uncomfortable with that and you need to tell me the truth about your own life being straight, feel free to tell me. It's nice to make other people live in my world. But I realized because of this weird myth that everybody believes that everybody's heterosexual, I thought, I might have to come out in one way or another every single day for the rest of my life. Not because there's anything wrong with being straight, but it's not me. So why would I want people to assume something that's not correct? But initially my list was very short. It was my parents and my 4 sisters who, they were living 3,000 miles away from me in Pennsylvania, which I decided was a good enough buffer zone for what was about to hit their fan. I was under no delusion when I came out to them as to what would happen. I knew as soon as I said, Mom and Dad, I'm gay, they would immediately think that it was God testing their faith. Because like a lot of fundamentalists, they believe that God sends these little tests throughout their life, and those moments are not to grow and evolve as people. They believe that they have to stand in what they already believe in and not compromise it in any way. Perhaps you've dealt with people like this, and the word stubborn comes to your mind, right? They would describe themselves as being faithful. So if you're ever in that situation and you're thinking stubborn, they're probably thinking faithful, and you're probably going to lose that discussion because faithful always wins out over stubborn to them. But my parents and sisters, they all believe the same way, just like I used to believe when I was a fundamentalist, that when they die and go to heaven, they have to give an account to God whether or not they've passed or failed all these little tests that he sent their way. And the whole shindig, which is not the biblical term, but the whole party starts with God giving everybody an empty crown to put on their heads, and then for every one of these little tests you've passed, you get a little star, which is presumably some kind of jewel, better be, to put in that crown. And the idea is to have passed so many tests that your crown is all shiny, heavy, sparkly, full of jewelry. Because on the way out the door, you have to give it back to God, and the shinier and heavier it is, the more it shows God how much you loved him while you're here on this planet. First of all, how gay is that whole scenario? Right? I know some of you have to be thinking that, right? Now, people have debated, even scholarly people have debated for a long time whether or not people composing parts of the Bible were gay, especially the King James Version of the Bible, which is the Bible that the fundamentalists believe in. Even questioning King James himself, right, is whether or not he was gay. And I want to put that all to rest tonight, right here, and you can feel free to pass this on. So in that version of the Bible, a man wrote his description of heaven, and it's a city with walls around it, which is odd enough as it is that heaven would have walls around it, right? It's like some private community. Ridiculous. But then anyway, the gates are made out of pearls. Fantastic. And then you open those pearly gates, and the streets are paved with gold. Fantastic. And then everybody's living in mansions wearing tiaras full of jewelry. That's about as gay of a city as any of us could ever hope to live in, right? I think for a lot of us boys in Sunday school, when we started hearing about this place, we're like, yeah, I really want to make sure I go there. And then we're like, oh, now I know why I want to go there. We figure it all out with all the glitter and the shininess and those pearly gates. I mean, who could resist that, right? Well, knowing that my parents, believed that this is what's going to happen to them, and my sisters as well, I knew that, if I came out to them, they weren't going to think, this is a chance for us to show Mark how much we love him. They were going to think, this is a chance for us to show God how much we love him. Two very different things. And so I knew that coming out to my family for acceptance was not going to be part of my life. I decided that what I needed to do was come out to my family for what was the right reason for me to do it, and that was for honesty. And that's, really what coming out is all about anyway. It's one person being honest with another person. We can package it however we want and call it whatever we want, but it's still just an honest conversation. In fact, I always say that coming out is not a debate, it's not a discussion, it's an announcement. That's all it is just an announcement. It's no different than me saying, somebody's shoes are untied. It's exactly that level. And we've allowed it to become a much bigger, more dramatic thing than it ever needs to be. I mean, when somebody comes home and tells their parents, if I was a boy and I told my parents that I liked a girl, is there ever any drama about that? Never. It's just an announcement. And we, as gay people, we've allowed our announcement to become something other than what it is for everybody else. So talk about equality. We need to make it equal when we come out, just like it is when straight people come out. It needs to be the exact same thing, which is just an announcement. So what I did is I wrote 9-page letters to everybody in my family. I wrote letters, first of all. First of all, I wrote one letter and I went to Kinko's and they all received a 9-page letter. But I decided to write letters because I wanted to make sure that everything was said the way that I needed it to be said. Because I really believe when you're coming out, it's one of the few times in life when it is all about you. It is not about the people that we're talking to. And I also wanted to make sure that the announcement did not become argumentative or debated. I just wanted everything to be said the way that I was comfortable. So I wrote the letters, I mailed them off, I followed up with phone calls. And they all responded, of course, exactly as I thought they would. They continued to believe what they had always believed about this, which I absolutely knew was how they would respond. I knew that me telling them I was gay was not going to make them, as they would see it, compromise their hope for eternity. That was not going to happen. But after coming out to my family, I started noticing that the only time that I would speak to them was when I initiated the conversation. I thought that was kind of odd, but then I thought back to the time when I left home to go to college when I was 16, and I realized that that's how it had always been. Ever since I had left home, I was always the person initiating the conversations. I was always the person, assuming there was some kind of a relationship there. And then I started looking at some of my friends, none of whom that were gay or at least out about it, who came from similar homes. And they had the same kind of life story. They were always the ones initiating the contact or trying to talk about an assumed relationship with their parents as well. And I remember the time when I was about 14, my sisters and I had this little discussion, and we talked about how we thought that maybe our parents didn't love us because we saw the next door neighbor kids interacting with their parents, and the dynamic was so different from what was happening in our home, and that was the only thing that we could decide was what was going on. And my sisters, of course, were very upset about that prospect. So I just did the fundamentalist Christian thing. I stepped up and I said, well, the neighbors are Methodist, So they're going to hell anyway. It doesn't matter what they do or how they live their lives. They're wrong about everything, because that is what fundamentalists believe. And if you've never heard that before, you just learned something else new. But we were right back then. We were right about our parents not being able to love, their kids. They were part of a version of Christianity that teaches them that they're not allowed to love themselves. So then it's impossible for them to love anyone else, whether it's each other or their kids or their friends or any other family members. And those Methodist parents were a good example of what a loving family was. And it was such a stark contrast to what we saw in our own home.